Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to review the newest lens from Laowa, which is the 180mm F4.5 1.5x ultra macro APO lens. Now, that is a mouthful of designations, but what we have here is a lens that I think is going to be unique and definitely have a position in the market. I've seen a lot of macro lenses in the 90 to 105mm range here on mirrorless platforms, and even some from the 50 to 65mm wider focal length range. But what I have seen very few of is actually long focal lengths. I kind of go all the way back to early days in Canon with the 180mm F3.5L macro lens. So this is a different kind of perspective. It gives you a longer working distance. It's going to give you a different level of compression on your shots. I think it's going to work for different kinds of macro work. Maybe less well for product photography, but better if you're wanting to capture insects or things where having that additional working distance is going to be very useful. On top of that, this lens has a higher than average macro magnification, 1.5 to 1 rather than 1 to 1 or so, or a 1.5 times magnification level. It also has an apochromatic design, which, as you know, means it's going to have very low aberrations, going to have great color saturation and pop like that. And it's also a really interesting lens, something really that I've never seen before, and considering I've reviewed hundreds and hundreds of lenses, that's interesting. And that is that this is a lens that, for the macro range, has a true manual focus ring and is a manual focus only lens. And so you have hard stops, mechanical stops on either end, you have constant distance markings, you have a smooth moving manual focus ring that will allow you to get that precision you want for macro work. However, you have the option that if you flip the ring all the way over to the right, you can, past infinity, you can actually go into autofocus mode, and from 1.5 meters out, you have an autofocus lens. And so as you can see here, I'm filming on the lens right now, as I will for these outdoor segments. And you can see that as I move along, autofocus is able to track me, and you have a typical autofocus lens. All of this for under $500, and I think you have a lens that is going to appeal to a lot of people. So today, in today's review, we're going to dive in and explore whether or not this is a lens that you should consider. Let's take a look. So in disclosure, this lens was loaned to me by Laowa. It will be going back to them at the end of this review. They have had no input in this review, and they will not see it before you. Now, I'm doing this review on Sony's E-mount, full frame E-mount, but there are also autofocus versions coming for Nikon Z, and interestingly, for Canon EF, not RF, but EF. Seems like Laowa's workaround for Canon not opening up their RF protocols to full-frame lenses to release an EF mount, which can then be adapted onto RF mount. Now, there are manual focus versions that will be available for Canon RF, and then also for L mount. For those platforms, they will have a native glass, but it just won't be autofocus. So interestingly, as I've pointed out, we have a roughly 280 degree true mechanical manual focus ring. And so this is a rare treat on mirrorless in that it's really, really gorgeous. It's got hard stops on either end. It's got distance markings along the way. It's got, hyperfocus markings. It looks like a traditional manual focus lens in that regard. However, which, by the way, took me a little bit to figure out because it's not particularly obvious. If you rotate all the way to the left here, you will find that past infinity there is a little yellow imprinted AF part. And if you go all the way to AF mode, anything past 1.5 meters and beyond, you can have autofocus. And so very interesting there. I do think the manual focus ring is fantastic, and obviously that's going to be an advantage over a lot of competing other macro lenses that are autofocus lenses because they won't have as good of an actual manual focus ring. There still are situations when close focusing that I actually still like having autofocus, particularly if I'm doing handheld work, sometimes trying to nail manual focus and then keep it there long enough to actually click the shutter. Can be a little bit of a fine art, and so I do like having autofocus for those type of situations. However, if I'm working off of a tripod, manual focus all day, every day, it is definitely the way to go. And frankly, for serious macro work, you're going to want to use a tripod anyway. There are 9 aperture blades here, and the aperture iris is electromagnetic. There is no aperture ring, and I'm not sure about the manual focus versions of the lens, if they will have a manual aperture ring or if they will have electronics and have electromagnetic aperture diaphragm. I haven't seen those other versions, and so that is still a mystery to me at this point. This one, however, you're going to be controlling aperture from within the camera. What you do have, however, is a custom or function button on the side, and that is going to perform whatever duty you have assigned to that in your camera body. If it's anything attached to autofocus, it's only going to work during that autofocus. If it's some other function, you can use it even when you are in the manual focus mode, so long as it's something that impacts something outside of autofocus. There is a USB-C, weather-sealed USB-C port that is near but not on the actual lens mount. There is a weather sealing gasket here at the lens mount. I'm not sure about internal seals. The previous lenses that I've tested from Laowa that did have a weather sealing gasket at the lens mount, they did not have internal seals. Obviously, the USB-C port has to be weather sealed as well, but that may be the only actual seal points on the lens, but something is better than nothing. Now, you may have noticed that this is a rather unique lens profile. Very slim, very long. It is only 67.6 millimeters in diameter, or 2.66 inches. That contrasts to a length of 136 millimeters, or 5.35 inches. And so it is essentially nearly twice as long as what it is in diameter. So a long, slender, unique kind of lens profile. And of course, if you put the lens hood on, because the lens hood is also slim, it just makes the lens longer and slimmer looking still. Up front, we do have a 62 millimeter front filter thread. It seems like a lot of the lenses that I reviewed in 2025 have had 62 millimeter front filter threads for one reason or another. Now, because this is all metal and glass, very high grade of construction, which has kind of been Laowa's hallmark from their very first lens, it is heavier. It's 523 grams, or 18.44 ounces. That's not uniquely or particularly heavy, but obviously relative for it being such a slim lens, it's a little bit heavier than what you might expect. However, I will point out that this is about half the weight of the older Canon 180mm F4.5 L series lens. And so a radical downsizing. And so again, for being a 180mm lens, not too bad when it comes to the weight. This does have Laowa's new design language, which is kind of a gunmetal / cobalt blue look. A unique finish with unique look to the manual focus ring and the badging. I like it. I like the fact that it is uniquely Laowa and that they aren't trying to copy someone else or produce a lens that looks just like something that we've seen before. And so I appreciate their new design language. I like the metal lens hood, which feels very high grade. Everything about the lens feels more premium than the price suggests. Now, one thing you will miss in a lens like this is lens-based stabilization. So yes, most of our camera bodies these days do have in-body image stabilization. However, on Sony, where I'm testing, I find that Sony stabilization is better, let's say under 135 millimeters. At telephoto lengths, it just doesn't seem as effective to me. I suspect you'll get a little bit better performance on Nikon Z-mount, as I have found Z-mount cameras that have stabilization VR built into them tend to be a little bit better with telephoto focal length than what Sony stabilization is. If you're on Canon EF, of course, none of those bodies have stabilization, though if you're adapting to RF, many of them do. And so just be aware you're not getting any lens-based stabilization, and that does make handheld macro work certainly more challenging, and so something to be aware of there. Minimum focus distance here is 30 centimeters or 1 foot. That is to get all the way to the 1.5 to 1 level of magnification. Now, if you're working at 1 to 1 level, you get about 6 or 7 more centimeters to work with there, and so really not a bad working distance at all. Here's what that maximum magnification of 1.5 looks like. And just for interest's sake, most macro lenses are 1 to 1. Here's what 1 to 1 looks of this shot compared to shooting the same subject at 1.5 times. You can see it definitely is a significant difference, and so that is an advantage that you have here relative to some of the competing lenses. All told, this is a unique and interesting package, and certainly for a price of under $500, it feels like a lot of lens and a good value for money. So let's talk autofocus. Laowa isn't specific as to what type of focus motor they're using in their newer autofocus lenses. I suspect it is some type of STM focus motor or stepping motor, just from the overall performance of the lens and the way that it feels. In this case, the pros include the fact that the autofocus motor is smooth, it feels refined, it's very quiet in operation. I was able to focus with precision even on fine or narrow subjects, and it had no problem locking on with accuracy in that. As you can see here, autofocus speed is average at best. This is a long focal length, and it feels like there could be a little bit more thrust in the focus motor, but you're able to get back and forth at moderate speeds. However, if you're making smaller, more typical focus type adjustments, it's fine. I found, for example, when Nala was rolling around, I was able to shoot and capture her with precision as she moved around, no problem with that. However, if you're tracking something that's moving more quickly, more persistently, I suspect that there are better options for that. However, I think the most useful thing here is that this is a lens that actually has really beautiful rendering, and it's a nice long focal length. It could be very useful also as a portrait type lens, and having autofocus for that makes a world of difference. I actually really like the optics of the IRIX 150mm f2.8. It's a lens that came out now probably 7 or so years ago, but unfortunately it was limited by the fact that it was only manual focus, and so even though it had beautiful optics, when you tried to use it for portrait work, it was a bit disappointing there because it was hard to nail focus and shoot with precision. In this case, having autofocus makes a huge difference. And so I think, again, if you're realistic about the kind of subjects you're trying to track, not sports, not something moving quickly, I think you're going to do just fine. And having autofocus outside of the macro range, very, very useful. And of course, within the macro type range, in most cases, having manual focus is preferable anyway. So in some ways, we've got the best of both worlds here. So how about video AF? Now, obviously, again, you're not going to have any kind of autofocus in the macro range, and so any kind of work you do for video in the macro range, you're going to be manually focusing. However, for other kinds of situations, you will have the ability to use autofocus. As you can see here, focus pulls, they're nicely damped overall. You can see, however, some visible steps there as it moves towards refining focus. So I definitely have seen better applications. Again, this is a long focal length, and so that means that there are some extra demands on the autofocus system, and I'm not sure that it's able to fully maximize when it comes to that. At the same time, I also found that for such a long focal length, focus breathing is pretty well controlled. And so that does add some value to the lens, that if you are affecting focus pulls, you're not going to get that kind of dramatic movement back and forth. And I felt overall that my hand test, it went reasonably well, moving from my hand to my eye and back and forth. This isn't the most reactive focus motor here. And so if you're trying to, do quick movements in and out, it's not necessarily going to react super well to that. But if you're looking for stability, and as you've been able to see in these outdoor shots, it has no problem in not only focusing accurately on myself as the subject here, but also you can see from the overall rendering that this is a lens that is able to produce some unique and beautiful looking video shots. And so again, as I said in the earlier autofocus section, I think this is all about managing your expectations. And if you have realistic expectations, you're probably going to be happy with the outcome. So let's talk optical performance. Macro lenses tend to need to be extremely sharp because when you're shooting those very fine details in macro work, it really comes down to being able to resolve those fine details. This is a lens design of 12 elements in 9 groups. 2 of those are extra low dispersion elements. 1 of those is an ultra high refractive index element. The MTF shows a very consistent, fairly flat sharpness profile across the frame, though as you get closer towards the edge, there's more of an astigmatism as you see the sagittal and meridional lines kind of diverge from each other there towards the end. So you're going to get better contrast in the center of the frame and less astigmatism and a little bit more out towards the edge of the frame. One of the things that really stood out to me when I was shooting at minimum focus distance is that it does have a very flat plane of focus. So that's really excellent in that, particularly if you're wanting to do something like reproduction of pages or other two-dimensional objects, it's going to be very useful for that. So that's great. It has basically no distortion, no measurable distortion that I could find at all. And vignette is actually, for being such a slim lens, vignette is actually well controlled. Just a plus 44 to correct for it. Expect that to be higher on Nikon Z mount, and I think probably having a maximum aperture of just f4.5 is going to help with that. There is an overall look to apochromatic designs, and this is an APO or apochromatic design. What I find is that I feel like APO lenses tend to produce images that just need less processing. There's a nice looking pop to them right out of camera. Color saturation and kind of color rendering is unique for APO lenses, and I appreciate that. You'll also see it when you are testing for longitudinal style chromatic aberrations. They're just not there, and that's really great for macro work. It means you're going to eliminate a lot of the fringing on shiny edges and things like that. There is some lateral chromatic aberration, and I noticed that mostly on my test chart. I didn't notice so much in the real world, and so probably not too much of a real problem, but there is a bit of that lateral style fringing there. And it could be a factor in some specific applications. What I found when I began to test for contrast and resolution, and this is on a 61 megapixel Sony a7R Mark V, crops that I'll show you will be at 200% level of magnification. What I found is that above all is consistency. The center, mid-frame, and corners are all fairly consistent with each other, a little bit less contrast as you get out towards the edge of the frame. And of course, you get towards the edge of the frame, there is a little bit more of that lateral style chromatic aberration that shows up, at least on my test chart. It is not radically sharp at any point, however. There is a little bit more contrast as you stop down to f5.6 and a hair more at f8, though you'd be hard-pressed to see the difference between f5.6 and f8. I wasn't surprised to find that when I went back and compared to my Tamron 90mm f2.8 macro, which has become kind of my daily driver for macro work, the Tamron is definitely the sharper and higher contrast of the two lenses, though 90mm is literally half of 180 millimeters. So I don't know that the two focal lengths are really comparable. Diffraction is going to show up around f11 and become very pronounced by f22, which is the minimum aperture. I would say that my assessment when shooting macro, and that was, using all of careful techniques, is that I didn't find that I was blown away by the level of sharpness. I would call it good, but not great. I certainly have seen sharper macro lenses and sharper macro lenses from Laowa, including my most recent one that I owned of theirs was the 90mm f2.8 2x macro, which manual focus only, so that had some limiting principles to it. However, it was an extremely sharp, high contrast lens. This is a little bit less so, I would say, and it could be just the nature of that focal length as well. What I did find exceptionally good was the bokeh quality. Something about this longer focal length and the amount of compression you have on shots allowed for, I think, images just to have a really nice look and rendering to them. And I also noticed that the foreground bokeh was really nice. It's nice and softly defocused, and it's really a good lens for doing layering type shots where you have a foreground defocused area, background defocused area, and then a sharp plane of focus in between those two. All of that looked really, really good. I also found that colors looked really, really rich. Like I said, APO images are special, and I considered a lot of images on a global level to look really special from this lens. I was less impressed when it came to flare resistance. Not only is there a bit of veiling or loss of contrast at wide apertures and a little bit of ghosting there, and then there's a little bit more ghosting, better contrast, but more ghosting when you're stopped down. But what I really noticed is that if the bright light source is right out of the frame, you've got very pronounced flaring and flashing that is taking place, as you can see as I pan back and forth. And so this is not a lens that you want to point at the sun. Fortunately, 180mm, that's a longer focal length. You're probably going to be able to avoid that. And for this shot, for example, where I had a less bright light at the end of the Bible with the ring in it, kind of a classic shot there, that it was fine. There was no issues with flaring for that. But certainly with something brighter like sun or spotlights, stay away from that. Overall, I would say that the optical performance has a lot of real strengths. It's just not quite as sharp as what I expected. So my conclusion is that this is an interesting lens, and I think it's going to have a market for those that have been waiting for a longer focal length, and also to have that versatility that this lens does offer between the higher level of magnification and also having autofocus for the situations where autofocus might be more useful. I will say on the negative side that I certainly have seen sharper macro lenses and sharper macro lenses even from Laowa themselves. And so if you're looking for absolute performance, this isn't their highest performing lens, and that may have something to do with that focal length in general. Maybe a little bit harder to engineer with the same kind of sharpness that we've come to expect from lenses like their 65, their 90, or their 100mm macro lenses. At the same time, however, this lens is sharp enough for most people in most situations, and so I think that it is going to be adequate for that performance. And at the price point of being right under $500, it certainly, as far as autofocusing macro lenses, this definitely becomes a really strong value proposition. Now, of course, not everyone needs 180mm as a focal length, and so there are going to be some who are going to be excluded simply by the length of that particular focal length. But if you are one of those that has been waiting for something longer to give you more working distance for insect work or things like that, this might be the lens that you have been waiting for. Now, if you want more information, you can either take a look at my full text review that is linked on the newly updated and revised dustinabbott.net. Take a look at the link in the description down below for that. There's some buying links there as well. Or if you want a deeper look at the optical performance, stay tuned with me right now, and we're going to jump into that together. Okay, starting off here, just take another quick look at, this is 1:1 level of magnification, and this is 1.5:1. Just shows you have some definite and significant advantages in your level of magnification when you're shooting at 1.5 times versus the 1 times magnification. Now we can see here that distortion is, if there's any kind of pincushion distortion there, it is so mild that it's not even worth correcting. Likewise, vignette is well controlled as well. That did require some correcting, but I was able to correct it in the +40 range, so no big deal there at all. In many situations, you could probably leave that uncorrected. Now, apochromatic lenses tend to be really fantastic in the way that they control color fringing. It's just the way that all the colors are focused. You can see here that it's basically flawless. Nothing before or after the plane of focused. Everything is just inky black. So that means that even here in this SLR that I use, that while there's lots of potential for fringing here in these areas, you can see that there is very little fringing to show up there. Nice and clean, and in the plane of focus there, nice sharpness and contrast as well. Now, while we're here, let's take a quick look at the bokeh geometry of specular highlights. So here at f4.5, then at 5.6. So very quickly, you're going to see the nonagonal shape of the blades, and that's a little bit more pronounced here at f8. I wouldn't say that aperture iris is perfectly symmetrical there, and so if you're looking for like really round specular highlights all across the frame, this probably isn't your lens. Now, while I saw no longitudinal style chromatic aberration, I do see some lateral style chromatic aberration, and you can see it particularly in this zone here where there's some of that false color on either side of the black and white transitions. Now, as we look at resolution and contrast, this is on a Sony A7R Mark V, so 61 megapixels. This is 200% magnification. So in the center of the frame, detail and contrast look good, but not exceptionally good. There's just not a complete precision to all of the textures. Here in the mid frame, the same is true, like it looks good, but it's almost as if there's a little bit of motion there, but I used a 5-second delay. I was very careful. I actually ran the test multiple times to make sure that that was not the case. It's just that the optics aren't quite maybe as crisp as what I would like. The corner looks good. This is probably what looks best to me relative to what most lenses do. It's good, but it's not exceptionally good. Centering seems to be quite good here, so I'm getting even performance all across the frame. But unfortunately, you can see some of that lateral style chromatic aberration here near the edges. So what I felt like is that at macro distances, like here, the image globally looks good. And so, but at a pixel level, 1:1 here, you can see that it's not flawless. There's a little bit of fringing there, but mostly the contrast and the detail, they just don't really pop in the way that I would necessarily like, and certainly that I've seen in other macro lenses. Here at a medium distance, again, globally, it looks great. As I punch in there, it looks good. But it's not what I would call exceptional either. This is probably my favorite in that I feel like the detail and contrast look good at this distance, and very good overall. So I mean, this image I think is where maybe it looks the best to me. Now, if we stop down to f5.6, which is the kind of like full stop marker, you can see that contrast has definitely improved here in the mid frame. Detail is still not fabulous, but contrast looks better. Likewise here in the mid frame, it's looking good there. If we go up into the corner, we can see that the corners are looking better. However, as you stop down, unfortunately, that lateral style chromatic aberration becomes a little bit more pronounced. So testing at f5.6 allows me to put out the comparison of the Tamron lens, and you can see here in the middle of the frame that the Tamron is definitely producing more detail. You've got that moire starting because the contrast and the detail is more significant. You look at the text here, it's just clear and more precise. Obviously, I've changed up the chart a bit since then, so we'll compare down here in the corners. You can see in the corners, again, it's looking just a little bit stronger for the Tamron. In this zone, it looks really, really significantly better for the Tamron. You can see all of the little ink dots there and with a lot of precision, which you can't to the same degree on the Laowa lens. Likewise here in this zone here, you can just see everything looks just a little bit more just crisp and precise there. And so definitely everywhere where we have the same chart to compare, it definitely looks better on the Tamron, particularly in this mid-frame or mid-range zone here. If I stop on down to f8, we can see comparing f5.6 and f8 in the middle, they are very close to identical. Here in the mid zone, I would say very, very slightly better contrast for f8. And if we look off into the corners, we can maybe see just a little bit extra there, though as before, we definitely can see, unfortunately, some of that lateral style chromatic aberration that is just a little bit even more pronounced here at f8. Now at f11, you'll start to see a little bit of softening due to diffraction, but by f22, it's pretty surprising actually how much diffraction has softened the image. You're probably going to want to avoid that. Now here at minimum focus distance, I love the fact that the plane of focus is nice and flat, so that's really great. Looking again here at a pixel level, it's as we've seen, it's good, but it's not exceptionally good. And so, just the amount of detail that's there, you're not really seeing kind of the weave of the fabric in the same way. And so anyway, again, good, not great. Likewise here, this looks good to me, good detail, good contrast there. The background, of course, you can really, really compress. So the bokeh quality at close focus distance is going to be fantastic because you have such a long focal length. But it's this shot, I think, that's one of my favorites. I feel like just the overall rendering looks really nice. I like the longer focal length for this kind of shot. And while, again, the detail isn't like blowing my mind, it looks good. Just the whole image to me is very, very pleasing. Likewise here, this is a handheld macro, and at f8, at its best, you can see the fine details that are there, and so I appreciate all of that. Certainly a usable image. Likewise in this shot, if we go into the focus area, which is on the diamonds here, again, good, but not like exceptionally good in terms of just rendering the fine details. But the image at large, I think, looks really nice. Finally, as we've already noted, flare resistance is not a strength for this lens. So with a static image here, you can see a little bit of veiling and ghosting. Stopping down, that ghosting pattern becomes more pronounced, even though the contrast is improved. But it's these big flashes like this that are really the greatest weakness there. And so I certainly would avoid pointing this towards bright light sources. So as always, thanks for sticking around to the very end, and I hope that deep dive into the optics has helped you to decide whether or not this is a lens for you. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.